All right, this is our last unit. It is topic 1 of the biology unit, and this is on the biosphere. So this is talking a lot about, in the biosphere, sort of the different species that live inside. We'll look at some food webs and sort of interactions between things living in an ecosystem. So our first slide here says, what is a species? Well, some organisms look very similar to each other, yet are characterized as different species. So it gives you the example here of a dog, a wolf, a coyote, a jackal, and a fox. They all look pretty similar, but they are all different species. Other organisms look very different from one another, yet they're characterized as the same species. So these guys probably look more similar than these guys, but these guys are the same species. So a species, what is it? Well, it is, I don't think, I'm not writing. Okay. A species is basically looking at their DNA and figuring out the things that make something, I guess, as similar as possible. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but hopefully it does as we move on. It says a species is defined as a group of organisms that can successfully breed with one another to produce fertile offspring. Yeah, so that's a better explanation. So, you know, you've had dogs before that, like a Chihuahua and a pug or something like that, or a golden retriever and a German shepherd. So we have dogs that are mixed with different breeds of dogs, and that's because they can do that and produce fertile offspring. So that means that the babies that they create can have babies, and that's all because they're the same species. If we try and mix some of these together, so like a dog and a wolf, we can create a offspring. They can mate, but the offspring will be not fertile. So those offspring that is created, they won't be able to reproduce, so they won't be able to have their own babies. Okay, so that's the major thing that distinguishes a species versus something that's not quite the same species. Right here, they give us an example of a horse and a donkey making a mule. So you've probably heard of this before. Some different features of a horse versus a donkey, and then what you see in a mule. A mule is definitely a good hybrid breed in the sense that they're tough. They can carry a lot of weight and move around, carrying or pulling large things, but mules aren't able to mate. So a mule can mate with another mule, but it's never going to have babies, okay? Because a horse and a donkey are not the same species. So with different relationships, it says relationships, I guess, between different species or the same species. There's a couple different types of relationships that we can have. And these relationships are called symbiotic relationships. These relationships help organisms survive. However, they can sometimes be harmful. So symbiosis is something like you are living together, you're having a relationship with something or someone. And if we're looking at this in the case of plants and animals in the ecosystem, they can have 3 different types of relationships. So we could have a mutualistic relationship or mutualism. We could have commensalism, and we could have parasitism. Okay, and we're going to go into what each of those things mean. You might have heard of these before, but I will explain each of them individually. So mutualism is the very first relationship, and this is a symbiotic relationship in which both organisms benefit. So I always write it like this. So each of them get a positive thing out of the relationship. It's a positive relationship. This is the best relationship to have, where You're both getting something out of it. And the example they give you is a bee and a flower. So the bee is using the flower, it's getting the nectar, and it's using that to create honey, which gives them food. And then the flower, well, the flower is losing its nectar, but as the bee is on the flower, it helps to pollinate. So it helps to spread the pollen from that flower to others so that it can reproduce. So it's a benefiting thing. They're both getting something positive out of that relationship. So this is the best relationship to have, where you're positive. The next relationship, parasitism. This is the worst relationship to have, where one organism's benefits and the other has a negative effect. Okay, so these are possibly relationships you've had in the past, hopefully not. But a parasite is, yes, one person's getting all the rewards and the other person is getting a negative thing out of the relationship. And the most common one we can think of is like parasites that we have. You've probably heard of parasites, or maybe you've had one yourself. A mosquito is a great parasite because the mosquito gets your blood and you get a itchy arm or a disease, depending on if the mosquito's gonna spread a disease to you. Okay, another one would be like tapeworms. You know, they eat the food that you're eating and then you're missing out on the nutrients, that sort of thing. So that's a positive for one species and negative for the other. Commensalism, this is a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits from the reaction and one doesn't really have anything. So it's not positive or negative. It's just a neutral. So I put that as a 0 because it's like one benefits and one doesn't get anything out of it. An example they have here is a clownfish and an anemone, where the clownfish uses the anemone to hide and helps it to protect itself, where the anemone gets really nothing out of it. It doesn't harm it by the clownfish being there, but it also doesn't benefit from the clownfish there. So that's a really good example of commensalism relationship. Okay. Some other relationships that we can definitely have are predator-prey relationships. Predator-prey relationships play an important role in community dynamics. So populations are kept in balance through these interactions. And an example here is showing this graph of snowshoe hare and lynx. And this is like a really popular predator-prey model. It basically shows over the years like how many, the red is the lynx and the snowshoe hare is the black on the graph. And it shows sort of like what the populations are at. So as the population of one goes up, the other one goes down, and that sort of thing. Actually, not really. So once it's sort of like it's sort of like a cycle where, let's see if I can. So right here, we see that that's the snowshoe hare. So the snowshoe hare are pretty high up, and these ones at the same time, not so much, but they're starting to grow. So once this one starts to go down, this one actually starts to go up. And as time goes on, basically they just sort of cycle with each other. So if we were to draw this out, not as specific as this, but we would see a like up, down, up, down, up, down. And then we really should see the other species going down, up, down, up, down, up. Because basically as this species has a high enough, lots of population, that gives more food to the lynx. And then as the lynx go up in population up here, well, they're eating more hares, so then the hares go down. And then because there's not as much hair around, then the lynx population goes down. And because there's less lynx, then the hare population goes up. And it's just, they're cycling back and forth between that sort of, one eats the other, and then the other one grows, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's sort of what you're seeing in this model, and that's what we would see as a predator-prey relationship. You sort of see that like it's a cycle, and there's a little bit of delay, obviously because, species have to get pregnant, have more babies, and there's a little bit of delay for the population to go up, and then it starts to go up, and then the other population will go down. So that's a predator-prey relationship, and that's a great dynamic relationship inside of a community. So we might not even know that any of this is going on, but biologists are studying the populations of many different species, plants and animals, and we can definitely see these sort of relationships, which is pretty cool. At least I think so. So inside of a food web, I guess you can say, or inside of a community or an ecosystem, we have different levels in our food chains. And these are known as trophic levels. The feeding relationship between different organisms in an ecosystem may be summarized by the trophic levels to which they belong. The first trophic level in any ecosystem is occupied by the producers. These are the plants, which are also known as autotrophs. So what this all means here is at the very bottom of our food chain, we've got plants. Every food chain, it has to start at plants. This one is a land food chain, and this is a water food chain. But regardless if we're in the water or on land, we need plants. And these are like the plants of the water, phytoplankton. Okay, so these, we all need those because we need something to start the energy of this chain. All of our energy in this food chain comes from the primary producers. And how do plants get energy? Well, they get it from the sun. So really, all of these food chains, they all start from energy from the sun. We can't necessarily lay out in the sun and get energy, but our food lays out in the sun and gets energy. Or our food's food lays out in the sun and gets energy. Okay, so this is something that is really important to note, is that really all energy that exists in the whole world comes from plants. So without our plants, we would not have the energy to be here today. And the word autotroph, so that one that they've wrote right here, autotroph means making own energy. So we need to make our own, we can't make our own energy, so we are not an autotroph. We are what they call a heterotroph, and that's the next one. So so we get our energy from autotrophs. Okay. So just sorry, I skipped a little bit ahead there. It says all remaining trophic levels consist of different types of consumers, which are also known as heterotrophs. So all of these remaining levels of the food chain, all the way up, those ones are all things that are consumers. And we start at primary consumers and work our way up to secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. All right? Notice how sometimes this becomes a little bit confusing. So these are primary consumers, but they're actually the second trophic level because the first level is the primary producers. So each trophic level is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the name that goes along with it is actually the one before, because Primary consumers are the second level. Secondary consumers are the third level. Tertiary are the fourth level, and quaternary are the fifth. All right, and decomposers may feed at any time or any of the trophic levels. So our decomposers are at all levels of of this food chain, because if any of these things die, like a mouse dies, well, decomposers are going to eat its body. So we can't just say that they're at the bottom, they're really at all levels of the food chain. Okay? So just to look at this food chain, so at the very bottom, our primary producer is a plant. That plant is eaten by a herbivore, which here is a grasshopper. So a grasshopper eats the plant. So the grasshopper can't make its own energy, but it gets it from the plant. Now we go even farther up. We've got a carnivore, a mouse. Well, the mouse can't make its own energy, so it eats the grasshopper. And the grasshopper got its energy from the plant, which got its energy from the sun. Working our way up, now a snake comes along and eats the mouse. So now the energy from the grasshopper is actually in the snake, because the snake ate the mouse that ate the grasshopper that ate the plant that got this energy from the sun. And then our very last level here, our fifth trophic level, we've got our biggest carnivores. So these would be our top predators of the food chain. This is going to be a type of bird. I'm going to say, I'm not too positive what kind of bird, but a bird of prey who's going to eat the snake. So the snake has got its energy from the mouse, that got its energy from the grasshopper, that got its energy from the plant, that got its energy from the sun, and now the energy that's inside of the bird is from all of those things below. All right, so does that sort of make sense, hopefully, to you on how these sort of food chains work? I hope so. According to the second law of thermodynamics, no process is 100% efficient. So with each conversion of energy that occurs, some of that energy is lost as heat. Energy conversions occur every time an organism is consumed. Its energy is converted into usable forms through the process of cellular respiration. As a result, there is less energy available for organisms at higher trophic levels, and this explains why there are often fewer large predators in ecosystems than producers or primary consumers. So what this all means is basically, if we had at the very bottom of the food chain is our plants. But really, at the bottom of our food chain is the sun. So the sun has all of the energy. The sun is 100% of our energy. From that sun, the energy that's actually captured by plants, we're going to say is 10% of that. And then because the grasshopper or the plants use some of that energy, the grasshopper only gets 10% of that 10%. So then they are left with 0.10%, and then so on and so forth. So from each level, farther and farther up the food chain, you're going to have less and less energy. And I don't know if they never gave you those numbers, so maybe you don't need to know those numbers per se, but from each level of the food chain, it's not 100% efficient. What's normally lost is 90%. So 90% is lost from one level to the next. And it makes sense. Like, imagine if you were thinking about all the food you ate in your life, you used a lot of it for energy. You used it to, make your body processes happen. You're thinking, you're running around, you're using up that energy. You're losing it as heat. You're creating heat in your body, and it's using up in cellular processes. So what's left over if someone was to harness the energy from your body, if some top predator came along and ate you, well, they're only going to gather about 10% of the energy that you ate in your entire life. Okay? That's probably a lot of energy, but not a lot in the sense that we've lost 90% of the energy put into you. Okay? So this sort of shows that, every level of the food chain, we lose more and more of the energy. And if we look at food chains, they tend to be in more pyramids because there's more species at the bottom of the food chain. And as we work our way up, there's less and less species, mostly because there's only so much energy to go around. And I think that's what it says right here. It says, this explains why there are often fewer large predators in an ecosystem than producers or primary consumers. So if we were looking at an ecosystem, we might only have 10 bears, but we might have several million mosquitoes or something like that. So showing that there's definitely the energy at the bottom of the food chain, there's going to be a lot more of those so that we can make up and get the energy that we need for the top of the food chain. Food webs. So this is what a food web might look like. Food chains are not really realistic because if we look at this food chain that we have over here, well, we know that mice don't only eat grasshoppers, they might eat other things, and then snakes eat more than just mice. So it's not really realistic to have like a food chain like this, but we do that just to simplify it for learning. This is more what it might look like in real life. So food webs, this is what a food web might look like. You can see the arrows that point to the thing, that's what they would eat. So if we look at the seal, the seal right there, we see that he is eaten by the whale. The leopard seal is also eaten by the whale. The penguin's eaten by the whale. So it points, the things that are pointing to it are the things that they eat. It says food webs are more accurate representation of feeding relationships than food chains because most organisms have more than one food source. This allows for a more comprehensive understanding of how energy is transferred through an ecosystem. All right? So more realistic of life is we would make these sort of food webs. Okay? And this is, if we were in class, we would do an activity about this. And we might do that this week depending on time. So an example says, which organism in the food web have the most energy? So in this one, which one has the most energy? Well, we would say definitely, I'm going to make a color code this. So that one's yellow. These would have the most energy. Because remember, the most energy is at the very bottom of our food chain. Which organisms are characterized as primary consumers? So I'll make that one red. Primary consumers would be the things that eat the plants. So that would be our mouse and our rabbit. What would happen if the rabbit population were suddenly to increase? So imagine the rabbit, which is right here, they were to increase. So all of a sudden there's more rabbits. Well, if there's more rabbits, then there would have to be less of their food source, right? Because there's more rabbits eating. So more rabbits eating would make this, the grass and the wildflowers population to go down. So I guess I can write that here. So it would make the primary, not primary, just the producers' population go down. So it would do that, but then it would also, if there was more rabbits, then it might make the population of these guys that eat the rabbits to go up, right? Just because they would have more food available. So I'm going to say make hawks and snakes go up. Okay. Number 4 says, what would happen if the hawk's population were to suddenly decrease? So if the hawks were going down, what might happen? Well, the things that the hawk eats would probably go up, right? So the snake population might go up, and then the rabbit population might go up. So I guess I can write that right here. I'm just going to write rabbits up, snakes up. Because they have no one or not as many things eating them. But again, if the snakes population went up, the rabbits might go down just because the snakes eat the rabbits. So, but initially the rabbits and the snakes would probably go up. And then what would happen if all the producers were wiped out by pesticides? So what happens if we had no wildflowers and grass? Well, like I told you before, if we don't have any producers, we don't have any ecosystem. So there would be no energy in the food web. And the species would die. Okay. So really, really important to realize is that if we don't have those producers, we don't have the things that use photosynthesis that capture energy from the sun, then we have no energy in the ecosystem. Okay. Oops. An example of how food systems, I guess, could go wrong, or food webs, they can predict which species are most at risk for bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation is the buildups of toxins in the tissues of organisms. Large predators or organisms who eat at higher trophic levels often contain a higher concentration of toxins in their tissues and are thus more at risk. So what this all means basically is, if this was the very bottom of the food chain, krill, and there's mercury in the water, that's why we have methyl mercury coming into the water from volcanoes and coal plants. So it's going into the water. The krill might get some of that toxins in their body. The salmon and pollock and oysters might, because they eat not just one krill, but they might eat 5 krills. So now these guys, I'm going to put little dots if you can see them. So let's say this krill or this salmon eats all of that krill. Well, they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So let's say 9 different dots there. And then those 9, the trout and the tuna come along, and then they eat a bunch of those salmon, and then they have, I don't know, many, many more, right? My little dots are the toxins. And then a shark or a pike or a halibut come along, and then they eat like 10 of those trout. And then we've got a huge problem. We've got species up in the food chain that have tons of toxins in their body. I guess I can just put a bunch of dots. So then we come along, and if we eat species like this, we could have possibly be getting toxins in our bodies, and that would not be good. So the mercury levels in these species, we should not eat very much, just because they could cause problems in our body. So large predators or organisms who eat at higher trophic levels often contain a higher concentration of the toxins in their tissues and are thus more at risk for dying from that, or being like toxic waste, or the classic bioaccumulation. An example of this is in this little video. I can't play it on here, but I will post it on the classroom. We'll stop right there, and we'll do part 2 after. All right.